I stood at the gravesite, my navy dress catching the wind as her whisper cut through the silence. "Thrift store chic," she said, loud enough for pity, soft enough for cruelty. My daughter-in-law didn't even flinch. My son looked away, not in shock, in habit. After 29 years of marriage, after holding Arthur's hand until it stilled, I was mocked like a stranger in borrowed clothes. She thought the insult would land and vanish. What she didn't see was the woman behind the fabric, me, and the war she'd just invited. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The September sky over Boulder was the sort of sharp, glassy blue that made grief feel indecent. Lydia Benson eased the door of the town car shut and let her hand linger against the cool black paint. The funeral director's voice murmured something about timing, but she barely heard it. Her fingers brushed the silk of the navy dress she'd chosen that morning. The one Arthur once said made her look like she carried the ocean with her. A black scarf trailed at her throat, knotted simply, anchored with a small silver brooch. Nothing flashy, nothing borrowed, entirely hers. The gravel underfoot shifted as she stepped toward the church steps. A hush rolled across the cluster of mourners in dark suits and muted hats. She felt their eyes grazing over her dress, the scarf, the restraint. Then came the voice, light, cutting, meant to pierce without drawing blood. "Looks like someone raided a thrift store." Callie, standing only a few feet away, arm looped with one of her perfectly curated friends from the boutique, her lipstick a shade too bold for the occasion. The words landed like coins dropped in a well, small, cheap, but echoing longer than they deserved. A few guests shifted, awkward glances flitting between widow and daughter-in-law. No one corrected her, not even Drew. He stood rigid, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes locked on the ground as though he could bury himself alongside his father if he just kept staring. Ruth Sims, however, heard every syllable. From her place at Lydia's side, she turned a slow, deliberate glare toward Callie that could have stripped paint from the church doors. Lydia caught her friend's arm before the words could fly. Her grip was light, but her whisper was firm. Let her speak, and she did. Callie smirked as though she'd won something, though no one clapped, no one laughed. Lydia inhaled, smoothed the scarf at her throat, and walked up the steps with measured grace. Every footfall was steady, unshaken, as though each stone had been laid centuries earlier just for her. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of lilies and old wood polish. Sunlight cut through stained glass, spilling fractured colors across the pews. Lydia chose the front row and lowered herself quietly, folding her hands in her lap. The dress shifted, catching the light on its deep navy folds. She kept her chin level, eyes fixed on the altar, never once glancing back. Callie's whisper dissolved into the shuffle of hymnals and murmured condolences. Lydia heard none of it. Her mind instead replayed Arthur's voice from long ago. "Wear what makes you steady. You never need louder than that." The service began. Pastors spoke, a choir hummed, scripture unfurled. Lydia didn't weep. She didn't fidget. Her silence drew its own orbit, an unspoken authority that dared no one to interrupt. When it came time for the burial, the mourners spilled into the crisp mountain air again, the procession winding toward the cemetery just behind the church. The ground smelled of damp earth and cut grass, sharp against the sweetness of the lilies. Lydia walked slowly, Ruth a pace behind her, as the casket was lowered into its narrow cradle. Callie dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief the size of a cocktail napkin. Drew stood beside her, hollow, his grief locked up somewhere Lydia couldn't reach. Words were said, prayers offered, dirt shoveled. The air held steady silence after the last handful fell. When people began drifting away in twos and threes, Lydia stayed at the edge of the grave, her scarf tugged by the breeze. That was when Callie approached, arms spread like she'd rehearsed it for a stage. She folded Lydia into a hug that smelled of perfume and calculation. Her voice, hushed but sharp enough to cut cartilage, slid against Lydia's ear. "We'll help with the will. Don't worry." The squeeze lingered just a moment too long, her nails pressing through the fabric of Lydia's sleeve. She pulled back with a painted smile for anyone watching. To them it looked like compassion. To Lydia, it felt like warning. Lydia didn't answer, not yet. Her silence was steady as the mountain ridge behind the cemetery. She let Callie walk away believing she'd scored another small, private victory. But as Lydia turned back to Arthur's grave, her eyes caught the gleam of her brooch in the sun. Quiet, sharp, unyielding. Let her think the will is hers to touch. The breeze carried the last notes of the hymn away, leaving only the scrape of shovels and soil. Lydia tucked her scarf into place, expression unreadable and thought. She just made the first mistake she won't see coming. The house felt cavernous without Arthur's voice. Even the ticking clock in the study seemed louder than it had been in years, punctuating the silence like a metronome for grief. Lydia slid her reading glasses down her nose and spread the documents across the wide mahogany desk. 2 stacks, neat and deliberate. On the left, the unsigned draft Callie assumed existed in stone. Its pages smelled of fresh toner, creased at the edges from being handled too often, like someone had rehearsed their future against its lines. Lydia's eyes skimmed the neat clauses. Lake house, business equity, joint accounts, promises Callie had built her empire upon, as though wanting equaled having. On the right, the real will. Filed years earlier, ironclad. Every signature and witness in place. Its edges were yellowed slightly from time, but the ink was as firm as Arthur's hand had been when he signed it. That document named Lydia, her alone, as trustee of the estate. No carve-outs, no bargaining chips. The lake house, the accounts, the land, all under her steady hand. She touched the older document gently, as though it carried Arthur's pulse. He'd done this quietly, without theater. A man who spoke rarely had made sure his silence was permanent. From the corner of the desk, Ruth's voice cut into the stillness. "Well," her friend said, arms folded, leaning against the doorframe. "Looks like the polyester did more than turn heads. It made sure no one noticed your knife until you've already cut the rope." Lydia offered the faintest smile, though her eyes never left the documents. Callie thinks she's walking into a ballroom. She has no idea the floor's already gone. Then let her dance. Ruth's grin was sharp, approving. The louder she twirls, the harder she falls. The phone on the desk glowed softly. Lydia tapped the screen and found Georgia Ling's number already queued. She pressed it, listening to the measured rings before a calm, precise voice answered. "Mrs. Benson," Georgia said, her tone both warm and surgical. "I was expecting your call." Lydia adjusted the brooch at her scarf, though there was no one to see it. "Arthur left me the trust, the filed version. I want to be certain everything stays as he intended." "You have nothing to worry about," Georgia replied. Paper rustled faintly in the background, the sound of someone who lived inside fine print. Arthur covered his bases meticulously. The draft means nothing. It was never signed, never notarized. Callie may stomp, but she's standing on air. Lydia let out a slow breath. Not relief, but confirmation. She'll expect the lake house. She'll expect more than that, Georgia corrected. And she'll be disappointed at every turn. When she pushes, she'll find herself clawing at walls that don't move. A pause, then softer. "She's in for a shock, Mrs. Benson." Arthur wanted it that way. For the first time that day, Lydia closed her eyes. She could hear Arthur's steady baritone in memory, reassuring, almost playful. "You'll know when to hold the line. Don't waste your words. Let the paper do it for you." The line clicked off, and the study returned to its hollow silence. Ruth stepped forward, her bracelets jingling as she rested a hand on Lydia's shoulder. "Don't gloat yet. Let the dress do its job." "The dress?" Lydia echoed, looking up. "Its cover," Ruth said with a wink. "Invisible until you're not. Let her keep underestimating you. There's nothing sweeter than watching a woman choke on her own arrogance." Lydia folded the draft will slowly, slipping it back into its manila folder. The real will she kept open on the desk, her fingers smoothing the page as though anchoring it against the world. Callie's words at the funeral still rang faintly in her ears. Thrift store, polyester, pity. Small jabs from someone who mistook cruelty for power. Lydia stood, her silhouette framed in the tall window. Beyond the glass, the Rockies cut into the horizon, eternal and unbending. She lifted her chin, her reflection blurred against the mountain view. Callie thought the battle was about appearances, about silk versus polyester. She couldn't yet see that the war was already lost. Let her speak, Lydia murmured again, almost to herself. But this time, her tone carried steel. The envelope landed on Callie's marble kitchen counter with a snap. She slid it open with a manicured nail, scanning the embossed letterhead, the dense paragraphs in legal script. At first she skimmed too quickly, assuming it would confirm what she already believed, that the lake house was hers, the boutique safe, the assets within reach. Then she reached the line that stopped her breath. Her name was nowhere, no lake house, no mention of her boutique, not even a token acknowledgement. Everything, every account, every property belonged to Lydia. Her vision blurred. She read it again, slower, as if she'd missed a line, a signature, a footnote. But the ink was clear. Her name had never touched the page. The scream came out jagged, shaking the crystal glasses in the cabinet. She rigged this, she shrieked, hurling the papers across the counter. Your mother rigged this entire thing, Drew, slouched at the breakfast bar in his suit from the funeral, rubbed his temples. He'd been drinking coffee gone cold, staring into the mug as though it might provide answers. Callie, don't Callie me, she jabbed a finger at the papers. You said your father wanted us to have the lake house. You promised. Do you see it there? Do you? Because I don't. He picked up the envelope carefully, reading it in silence, his jaw tightening. His voice, when it came, was flat. This is filed, witnessed, legal. My mother didn't forge a thing. Callie slammed her hand on the counter. Don't you dare defend her. She's been plotting this for years. She hated me. She's always hated me. Drew looked up at her then, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. She tolerated you. That's not the same as hate. 2 days later, Georgia Ling's office smelled of cedar polish and quiet authority. The blinds were half drawn, muting the bright Colorado sun. Lydia sat across from the lawyer's mahogany desk, Ruth beside her, bracelets clinking as she crossed her arms. Drew occupied the far end of the room, his shoulders hunched like a boy dragged into the principal's office. Callie paced the carpet in her designer heels, the click-click-click echoing louder than any argument. Georgia adjusted her glasses, her expression composed. She tapped the papers neatly into alignment. Mrs. Benson, she said evenly, though her gaze fixed on Callie. This was legally filed. Proper signatures, witnesses, notarization. It's airtight. That's a lie, Callie snapped. She jabbed the desk with her finger. My name should be there. He promised me that house. Everyone knew it. Your name, Georgia replied, voice clipped, is nowhere near this document, nor the trust. Arthur Benson executed this will years ago. If he discussed drafts with you, he never acted on them. Callie whirled toward Drew. Are you going to sit there while she destroys us? Say something, do something, Drew rubbed his forehead. I don't want this going public. Dad worked his whole life for that reputation. Can we resolve this privately? Callie stared at him as though he'd grown another head. Privately? She's stealing our lives. Lydia finally spoke, her voice calm as stone. Arthur gave me everything. All I'm doing is protecting it. The room stilled. Even Callie's heels paused mid-step. Lydia's words weren't defensive. They carried the weight of inevitability, like a verdict already handed down. Ruth leaned back in her chair, lips curling. Well, here's to polyester queens with power. She raised the bottled water in her hand like a champagne flute and took a long, deliberate sip. Callie turned scarlet. You're both pathetic. Georgia cleared her throat, redirecting the tension. "Mrs. Benson," she said, nodding toward Lydia, "you are fully within your rights. Callie, you may challenge this in court, but you should know, you'll lose. The paperwork is ironclad, and every challenge will cost you." Callie opened her mouth, but Drew's hand shot up. His face was pale, his voice weary. "Enough, Callie, just enough." Her jaw snapped shut, eyes narrowing at him with something between disbelief and betrayal. Lydia, still composed, folded her hands on the desk. Inside, a flicker of Arthur's voice echoed, "Don't waste your words. Let the paper do it for you." She had spoken only once, but it had been enough. As the meeting broke, Callie stormed out, slamming the glass door so hard it rattled in its frame. Drew followed more slowly, silent, torn. Ruth leaned toward Lydia, her eyes bright with satisfaction. "You didn't just win," she whispered. "You cracked her mirror, and she can't live without her reflection." Lydia touched the brooch at her scarf. Steady, unreadable. She knew the storm was only beginning. By Monday morning, the numbers began to move. Lydia sat at Arthur's old desk, the one carved with scratches from decades of use, her laptop open beside a neat folder of account information. The cursor blinked on the bank's secure portal as she entered each instruction with quiet precision. First, freeze the joint accounts Drew and Callie had siphoned for years, under the assumption that Arthur's generosity was infinite. With a few keystrokes, the river dried. Second, restrict access to the boutique line of credit, one Arthur had co-signed before his health declined. It had been Callie's lifeline, though Lydia suspected her daughter-in-law thought of it more as a personal purse. By noon, it was gone. A ping confirmed the changes. Lydia removed her glasses, folding them carefully as if to honor the finality of the act. She hadn't stolen anything. She had only closed the vault Arthur had trusted her to guard. Callie noticed by afternoon. At the boutique, her phone erupted with alerts. 2 mortgage payments had bounced, each flagged with sharp red text. Her manager whispered about HOA notices piling up in the mailbox. Callie shoved the papers into her purse and stormed out, heels clattering across the polished floor, fury spiraling louder than the customers who pretended not to notice. She dialed Drew on the drive home, voice slicing through the car's Bluetooth. "She's cutting us off. Every account, gone. Do you understand? We can't even cover payroll this month." On the other end, Drew's silence stretched long. Finally, his voice came, low and brittle. "She has the right, Callie. You know she does." Callie slapped the steering wheel so hard her hand stung. "She's killing us on purpose." That evening, Lydia sat with Georgia Ling at the polished conference table, papers spread like a surgeon's instruments. The lawyer pointed to the highlighted lines of the prenuptial agreement Arthur had insisted Drew and Callie sign before their marriage. Arthur anticipated this, Georgia said, tapping the clause with her pen. If Drew and Callie ever divorced, she'd walk away with nothing but personal belongings. No real estate, no family accounts, no stake in Benson assets. Lydia studied the document. It wasn't cruelty. It was Arthur's version of insurance, a shield for the family name. Now it was her shield. "I want the trust updated," Lydia said, her tone measured but unyielding. Every clause, every transfer, secured. No cracks for her to crawl through. Georgia's mouth curved into a faint, approving smile. "I'll see to it immediately." Later that week, Drew arrived at his mother's home. He carried exhaustion in his posture, his tie loosened, his hair unsettled. He didn't sit. He hovered by the mantel where Arthur's photograph rested, fingers grazing the frame. "Mom," he began, his voice a quiet plea. "Callie's unraveling. She feels cornered." Lydia set her teacup down with care. "Cornered people show you who they are, Drew." "She's scared," he pressed. "If you could ease off, even a little, it might stop this before it gets worse." Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "You can't fix what you refuse to name, and I won't undo what Arthur entrusted to me because she mistakes privilege for ownership." The words stung him. He looked away, ashamed. Though whether for Callie or himself, Lydia couldn't tell. George's letter went out the next morning, formal and concise. Mrs. Callie Benson has no standing to contest the estate. Any attempt to pursue litigation will result in immediate dismissal and financial penalty. The language was precise, every syllable as unyielding as stone. Lydia read it once, then tucked it into her file without ceremony. It was not a threat. It was a fact. That night, Ruth joined Lydia on the patio, the mountains dark against the starlit sky. She carried 2 glasses of wine, handing one to her friend before settling into the chair beside her. "So," Ruth said, raising her glass in mock cheer, "our little boutique queen just realized the mannequins aren't the only ones hollow inside." Lydia allowed herself the smallest smile. Ruth clinked her glass softly against Lydia's. "Let her swing all she wants. You've already cut the rope." Lydia took a sip, eyes fixed on the silhouette of the Rockies. Callie was flailing, yes, but Lydia knew a woman like her didn't go down quietly. And that was precisely what she was waiting for. The article was supposed to save her. Callie had slipped the editor a flattering headshot, a pearl-choked portrait that said, "Grace, under fire." The op-ed bore her name in bold serif font, "A widow's duty ignored. Why Arthur Benson's legacy belongs to family, not lawyers." She thought it would read like gospel, her words smooth enough to sway the town's sympathy. Instead, the backlash arrived within hours. The paper's comment section overflowed. "That woman's never respected Lydia. Arthur trusted his wife for a reason. Callie's boutique only survived because of Benson money. Everyone knows it." By nightfall, the editor quietly replaced her portrait with a stock photo of church pews, distancing the paper from her name. At Sunday service, a deacon with a broad voice and broader shoulders leaned into the pulpit announcements. After listing choir rehearsals and soup kitchens, he paused, eyes scanning the congregation. "Arthur Benson," he said, voice heavy with affection, "was a man who treated his wife with respect. Some of us," his eyes flicked toward Callie's immaculate hat in the 4th pew, "could take a note. Because I've seen with my own eyes how Callie's always looked down on Lydia. And that ends now." Murmurs rippled through the sanctuary. Ruth, seated beside Lydia, hid a grin behind her hymnal. Lydia's face didn't move. She simply lowered her eyes to the page, letting the choir's closing hymn rise above the whispers. By Monday, the boutique was quieter than a library. Appointment books that once brimmed with names now showed neat blank columns. 2 longtime clients canceled fittings with polite excuses that dripped with avoidance. Another sent a curt text. "We're taking our business elsewhere." Callie stood at the counter, staring at the empty calendar. Her assistant, a college student with shaky eyeliner, shifted awkwardly. "People are saying things," she muttered. "That Arthur covered the bills here. That without him—" "Get back to work," Callie snapped. But her voice cracked, brittle at the edges. The assistant didn't argue. She simply picked up her purse and left for good. The bell above the door chimed like a funeral toll. That afternoon, Georgia Ling spread a new file across her desk. Lydia sat across from her, scarf draped neatly, pen in hand but untouched. Ruth leaned back in the corner, her bracelets chiming like punctuation marks. Georgia's voice was precise. "The IRS has flagged unpaid back taxes on the boutique. Arthur covered them for years, quietly. Without his checks, they've come due. 6 figures. Callie doesn't have it." Lydia tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of curiosity. "So the scaffolding is gone." "Exactly," Georgia replied. Every beam she leaned on was Arthur's, not hers. Lydia's hand brushed her brooch, fingers cool against the metal. Her voice was low, certain. "Then let her feel what it's like to stand without scaffolding." Ruth raised her glass of iced tea in mock salute. "Amen." 2 days later, Callie stormed into Georgia's office like a gale, designer heels biting into the hardwood. The receptionist tried to intercept her, but Callie pushed past, eyes wild, papers clutched in her fist. You think you can humiliate me, she spat, slamming the IRS notice on Georgia's desk. This is a setup. Lydia's behind this. I know she is. Georgia didn't flinch. She stacked the papers neatly, her calm a direct foil to Callie's storm. Mrs. Benson, these taxes are the government's doing, not Lydia's. Arthur shielded you, yes, but he's gone. You're responsible now. That's a lie, Callie's voice cracked. I won't be ruined by that woman. From the doorway, Lydia stepped in, scarf draped loosely, Ruth at her side. She hadn't planned to interrupt, but the raised voices carried down the hall. Her presence sucked the air from the room. Callie spun toward her, face flushed, eyes glassy. You think you're so clever, don't you? Hiding behind your scarves and your lawyers. But I see you. You're trying to erase me. Lydia's gaze didn't waver. I don't need to erase you, Callie. You're doing that yourself. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Callie's chest heaved, her lipstick smudged at the corner of her mouth. Georgia folded her hands. Ruth crossed her arms, and Lydia stood serene, unshaken. Callie grabbed her papers and fled, heels hammering down the hallway. The glass door slammed, rattling in its frame. Lydia exhaled slowly, as though releasing the last note of a hymn. She turned to Georgia, her voice even. File whatever you need to. I'll be ready. Georgia nodded. So will I. The mediation notice arrived on crisp letterhead, all capital letters meant to intimidate. Callie's lawyer demanded a meeting, promising amicable resolution. Lydia almost smiled at the wording. Nothing about Callie had ever been amicable. Georgia arranged the session at a neutral downtown office, a sterile space with pale gray walls and a conference table too large for the room. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their hum the only sound until the parties began to arrive. Callie swept in first, her heels snapping like gunfire against the tile. She wore black silk that shimmered when she moved, a necklace heavy enough to be armor. Behind her trailed her attorney, a man with the slick confidence of someone who billed by the hour and measured victories and settlements, not truths. Lydia arrived minutes later, her steps unhurried. Today's dress was another understated piece, taupe cotton, simple in cut. Around her neck hung a small pearl brooch, luminous but modest. Callie's lips curled at the sight, mistaking it again for weakness. Lydia lowered herself into her chair without a word. Ruth took the seat at her side, arms folded, eyes bright. Georgia settled across from Callie's lawyer, her files neatly stacked, her expression unreadable. The mediator, a balding man with a tired smile, cleared his throat. We're here to find common ground. Let's keep this civil. Callie's lawyer leaned forward, his tone sharp. My client is entitled to the Benson Lake House, as originally promised in draft revisions. She is also entitled to continued financial support for her boutique, which Arthur Benson contributed to regularly. Georgia adjusted her glasses. Draft revisions are meaningless. The only legally binding document is the will executed and filed. And in that will, Lydia Benson is sole trustee. There is no entitlement, no allocation, and certainly no ongoing support for a private business. Callie slapped her palm against the table. This is theft! Georgia's tone didn't rise. This is law. And the law is not on your side. The mediator tried again, his voice hesitant. Perhaps there's room for compromise. There's no compromise with a thief, Callie barked, pointing at Lydia. She's robbed me of everything Arthur wanted for us. Lydia finally spoke, her voice even and steady. Arthur gave me everything. All I'm doing is protecting it. The silence that followed was heavy, final. Even the mediator seemed to feel its weight. Ruth leaned toward Lydia, whispering just loud enough for the table to hear. You're watching her unravel in designer heels. Callie's face flushed crimson. You think this is funny? You're flaunting your polyester while my life crumbles. Lydia turned her gaze on her daughter-in-law, calm and unyielding. You mocked my clothes. Now you're wearing consequences. The words landed harder than any legal argument. Callie's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his file as if searching for a page that could undo the truth. There wasn't one. The mediator scribbled a note, then sighed. "This isn't productive. Without standing, Mrs. Benson." He nodded toward Callie. "There's nothing I can enforce. This session is concluded." Callie shot to her feet. "You can't just dismiss me." But she had already been dismissed. By the law, by the facts, by the silence of the room. Her heels thundered as she stormed out, her lawyer scrambling to keep up. Later that evening, Drew appeared at Lydia's door, shoulders sagging, his tie undone. He looked like a man torn in two. "She wants me to sue you," he said, his voice raw. "She begged me in the car all the way home. Said if I loved her, I'd fight for her." Lydia poured him tea, steady hands betraying nothing. "And will you?" His eyes glistened, shame shadowing his face. "No, I can't. Not against you. Not for this." For the first time in weeks, Lydia reached out, resting her hand over his. He didn't pull away. "She'll never forgive me," he whispered. "Perhaps not," Lydia said softly. But forgiveness and freedom rarely wear the same face. From the darkened street outside, Callie sat in her car, headlights off, fingers clenched around the steering wheel. Through the window, she saw Drew's silhouette at the table with his mother. The sight was gasoline to the fire already consuming her. Her lips pressed into a thin line. If the law wouldn't give her power, she would find another way. The manila folder landed on Georgia Ling's desk with a quiet slap. She slid the deed records across the polished surface toward Lydia, the corners crisp and damning. "Transferred 6 years ago," Georgia said, tapping the signature line. "Arthur gave you the lake house outright. Recorded with the county, sealed, uncontested." Lydia adjusted her glasses and studied the page. Her husband's looping signature was familiar, steady even in the years when his hand had begun to tremble. He did it quietly. "As always," Georgia replied. Ruth leaned forward, her bracelets chiming like wind chimes in a storm. "Please tell me you left her a note on the door." Lydia's lips curved into the faintest smile. Not a note, a receipt. 2 days earlier, she had driven to the lake property at dawn, the water still glassy, mist rising like breath. She'd called a locksmith who worked in silence, swapping out the brass deadbolts for steel. When the man finished, Lydia handed him a signed check and walked through the empty house, her heels echoing on hardwood floors. On the kitchen counter, she'd placed a single envelope addressed to current occupant. Inside, a photocopy of the deed transfer, stamped and certified. It wasn't a message. It was evidence. By the weekend, the Homeowners Association had circulated its quiet verdict. Callie's name was struck from the social committee roster, a line neatly crossed out in the newsletter that hit every mailbox in the neighborhood. No explanation was offered, none required. At Sunday's gathering, Lydia overheard 2 women whispering near the buffet table. "She's finished." Everyone knew that boutique was just a prop. Their voices carried no sympathy, only the cool detachment of witnesses at a spectacle. Lydia didn't correct them. She ladled punch into her glass and moved on. The boutique's death came next. Creditors called. Suppliers withdrew. The bankruptcy filing appeared in the Business Journal with all the elegance of a public obituary. Benson & Co. Boutique, LLC, Chapter 7. Lydia read it once over her morning tea, folded the paper neatly, and slid it beneath the others in her file. She didn't gloat. She didn't flinch. She simply cataloged it. Another domino that had tipped of its own accord. Drew appeared at her door again, his frame thinner, his suit wrinkled from too many nights on couches. This time he didn't linger in the doorway. He dropped his keys onto the counter with a clatter and said flatly, "I moved out." Lydia poured coffee into a second cup, setting it in front of him. "The rental." He nodded, staring into the dark liquid as though it might swallow him whole. "It was easier than fighting over utilities that don't exist anymore." His mouth twitched. "She's furious. She says I abandoned her." "You chose peace," Lydia said softly. "Peace feels a lot like shame right now." Ruth, seated in the armchair, sipped her wine. "Shame passes. Bankruptcy doesn't." Drew cracked a hollow laugh, but it died quickly. He rubbed his temples. She won't stop. You know that, right? Even now. Lydia rested her hand against her brooch, the cool metal grounding her. Let her claw at shadows. She'll find nothing solid to hold. That night, Lydia returned to the lake house alone. The locks clicked smoothly beneath her key. Moonlight silvered the water, the waves lapping soft against the shore. Inside, the house was silent, emptied of Callie's curated chaos. No candles, no silk throws, no curated books stacked for effect. Only Arthur's framed photograph remained above the mantel, steady and unpretentious. She ran her fingers across the wooden banister, inhaling the cedar scent that had always clung to the place. For the first time in months, she let her shoulders drop. But peace was fleeting. From the window, she noticed headlights idling at the far end of the drive, engine humming low. Too far to make out the face behind the wheel, but Lydia didn't need to. She knew who had come to stare at a house that had never been hers. It was Ruth who saw him first. They were leaving the grief support group on a gray Tuesday evening. The church parking lot slick with drizzle. Lydia adjusted her scarf while Ruth paused mid-step, narrowing her eyes toward the far row of cars. A man leaned against the hood of a silver sedan, phone in hand, posture too casual for a place heavy with mourning. His suit was trim, but not new. Ruth let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. That's Callie's supplier. She used to brag about him at luncheons, how he had access to rare fabrics and jewelry lines no one else could touch. Her mouth curled. Looks like he's supplying more than scarves. Lydia followed her gaze. The man's hand lingered too long when Callie appeared, stepping out of her SUV in a red coat that screamed defiance against the rain. She laughed too loudly, touched his chest with familiarity, then ducked into the passenger seat of his car. The sedan pulled away, taillights cutting through the mist. Ruth crossed her arms. Tell me you saw that. I did. Lydia's voice was flat, but her mind had already begun turning the pieces. Callie, so desperate to craft an image, had let the seams show. The photos arrived the next morning. Ruth's neighbor, a retired teacher with an expensive camera and an endless appetite for gossip, had snapped them after seeing the pair dining at a restaurant 2 towns over. The images were crisp, Callie leaning too close across a candlelit table, her hand brushing the man's wrist, her lips parted in laughter that wasn't meant for mourning. Lydia placed the photos into a plain envelope. No letter, no explanation, just evidence. She slid the packet across Georgia's desk. Forward them, Lydia said. To? Georgia asked. Her attorney. Lydia adjusted the pearl brooch at her scarf. Anonymously. Georgia regarded her for a long moment before nodding. Consider it done. By Friday, whispers wound their way through town. At the coffee shop, a pair of women hunched over their lattes. She was stepping out before the will ink dried, one murmured. Figures. Arthur's body wasn't even cold, the other replied. At the grocery store, a clerk folded Lydia's paper bag carefully, leaning in with quiet reverence. You deserve better than how she treated you, Mrs. Benson. Everyone knows it now. The tide had shifted. The woman who once held sway with curated smiles and boutique fittings was being gutted by her own reputation. The church reacted next. The deacon who had defended Lydia weeks earlier made no direct mention of Callie, but his sermon rang clear. Pride may dress itself in silk, but it cannot cover betrayal. Those who dishonor vows will find no place at this table. Afterward, Callie lingered at the church doors, waiting for the familiar stream of friends. This time, they passed her by with stiff nods, murmuring excuses about errands and early dinners. The minister's wife, who once coordinated events with her, pressed a hand to Lydia's arm and whispered, We're with you. Callie heard every syllable. That evening, Drew arrived at Lydia's house again, this time without even knocking. His face was pale, his tie loose, his voice raw. I don't know who I married, he said, sinking into the sofa as though gravity had betrayed him. People are saying things. They're showing me pictures. He broke off, his throat tightening. Lydia handed him a glass of water, her touch steady. Grief clears your sight, Drew. Look closely. You'll see what you ignored for too long. He stared into the glass, his reflection trembling on the surface. Was she ever the person I thought she was? Lydia lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her scarf catching the lamplight. She was always the person she chose to be. You just chose not to see it. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unspoken, until Drew set the glass down with trembling hands. Later that night, Lydia stood by the window of the lake house, moonlight bending across the water. In the distance, she caught the faint flicker of headlights again, lingering at the edge of the property. But this time, a second shape moved within the car. Not just Callie. The supplier was with her. Their shadows bent close together, too intimate for denial. Lydia's lips pressed into a line. She reached for the file where the deed rested, her hand grazing the brooch at her scarf. Callie thought she could bury her mistakes in charm and fabric. But affairs had a way of surfacing, loud, messy, impossible to hide. The county courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, a place where reputations went to die quietly. Callie swept through the double doors like she owned the marble floor beneath her heels. Her black suit clung like armor, her lipstick painted brighter than the flags outside. She carried her accusations in a leather portfolio, convinced they would stick if she spoke them loudly enough. Lydia entered more quietly. She wore a slate gray dress that fell past her knees, the fabric plain except for the brooch pinned at her collar. She walked as though the courthouse was just another corridor of Arthur's university boardrooms. Ruth and Georgia flanked her like steady bookends. The bailiff called the case, Callie Benson versus Lydia Benson. A smattering of journalists shuffled in the back row, cameras tucked but ready. Callie's lawyer rose, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, my client has endured repeated harassment at the hands of the defendant. Mrs. Lydia Benson has interfered with her personal and professional affairs, spreading falsehoods that have damaged her reputation and safety. We ask for a restraining order, immediate and enforceable. Callie sat straighter, her chin lifted, eyes scanning the small crowd for sympathy. Judge McAllister adjusted his glasses. You've submitted supporting evidence? Her lawyer nodded. Affidavits, witness statements. Georgia rose slowly, her file thick and organized. Your Honor, we've reviewed these claims. They are nothing but whispers. No police reports, no documented incidents, no credible witnesses. What we do have, she slid a series of printed emails across the bench, are threatening messages written by Mrs. Callie Benson herself, sent to my client, to her staff, even to me. You'll regret this. I'll ruin you. You don't know who you're dealing with. Every line signed by her hand. Callie's lawyer flushed. Those were taken out of context. Context? George's voice sharpened like glass. The only context here is desperation. The judge flipped through the stack, his expression tightening with each page. He looked up over the rims of his glasses. I see no credible evidence of harassment from the defendant. I do, however, see a troubling pattern of threats from the plaintiff. Motion denied. Restraining order denied. Furthermore, this court fines the plaintiff for filing a false claim. $5,000. The gavel cracked once, decisive as thunder. Callie gasped, her face blanching. Then flushing red, she surged to her feet. This is a sham. She's buying you all. Sit down, Mrs. Benson, the judge barked. Lydia did not move. She simply folded her hands in her lap, eyes calm. When Callie finally sank back into her chair, shaking with rage, Lydia's voice cut through the silence, low but clear enough for the courtroom to hear. That's what happens when you build your case on whispers. The journalist scribbled furiously, pens scratching like a chorus of cicadas. By evening, the headlines bloomed online. Callie Benson fined for false harassment claim. Local outlets piled on, rehashing every detail of the boutique's bankruptcy. The social committee removal, The leaked photographs. Talk radio dissected it with relish, callers chiming in with stories of Callie's sharp tongue and colder demeanor. Within 48 hours, her boutique shuttered for good. The windows were covered with brown butcher paper, a foreclosure notice taped crooked on the glass. The once polished mannequins stood inside, stripped of dresses, their plastic eyes staring blankly at an empty street. Ruth drove Lydia past the building one evening, slowing the car so she could see. "Well," she said, her tone half pity, half satisfaction, "there's her empire, packed up and hauled out in cardboard boxes." Lydia's eyes lingered only a moment before turning back to the road. It was never an empire, just scaffolding painted to look like stone. Ruth gave a low laugh. And now the paint's peeling. But Lydia wasn't celebrating. The court had ended one chapter, yes, but the headlights she had seen lingering outside the lake house remained in her mind. Callie had lost the law, the church, the town. That left her cornered, and cornered women often clawed deepest. As Lydia locked her door that night, her hand lingered on the brooch at her collar, the metal cool against her skin. Arthur's voice echoed faintly in her mind. "You never need louder than steady." Still, she checked the window once more before drawing the curtains shut. Because Callie Benson wasn't finished. Not yet. Snow still clung to the mountain ridge when Lydia stepped onto the campus of Boulder Women's College. The air was sharp, alive with the chatter of students rushing between classes, their scarves trailing behind them like banners. Lydia moved slowly, measured, as though she were carrying Arthur with her in every step. The new library wing gleamed in the morning light, glass and stone intertwined. Modern lines anchored by the strength of its foundation. Above the entrance, newly unveiled letters spelled, "The Arthur and Lydia Benson Wing of Knowledge." It had taken months of planning, meetings, signatures. She had donated a significant portion of the estate to fund it, not out of charity, but conviction. Arthur had believed in education as the truest inheritance. Lydia knew this would stand longer than Callie's boutiques, her social committees, her borrowed jewelry. Inside, the air smelled of fresh paint and polished oak. Students and faculty gathered in the atrium, their voices hushed, eyes drawn to the stage where a microphone waited. Lydia stood at the podium, hands resting lightly on the wood. Her scarf was navy, pinned with a simple brooch Arthur had given her on their 15th anniversary. She scanned the room, her gaze landing briefly on Drew. He sat near the front, his posture quiet, his grief worn differently now. Not heavy, but contemplative. He nodded once at her, small but steady. Lydia drew in a breath and began. "Legacy," she said, her voice carrying with calm authority, "is not the noise we make in our lifetime. It's the shape we leave behind." Arthur believed in building quietly, not for applause, but for endurance. This wing stands because he never confused volume with value. The room was silent except for the echo of her words. She continued, her tone softer now. "When you walk these halls, when you open these books, remember that what lasts is not what people say about you in the moment. It's what endures after they've forgotten the sound of your name. Arthur knew that, and I am honored to carry it forward." Applause rose, warm and unforced. Drew wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, his shoulders trembling briefly before he straightened again. Afterward, Ruth joined her on the steps outside. The wind tugging at her crimson scarf, she slipped her arm through Lydia's and grinned. "Well, darling, you didn't just bury her, you planted something." Lydia allowed herself the faintest smile, her gaze fixed on the letters etched in stone. That's what Arthur would have wanted. That evening, back at the lake house, Lydia sat at her desk with pen and paper before her. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound besides the faint scratch of ink on parchment. Her new will was short, spare, every clause written with George's precision. Assets divided thoughtfully between institutions and the next generation of students who would never know her name, but would know her legacy. At the bottom of the final page, one line stood clear, unambiguous. Callie Benson is permanently excluded from this estate and all its trusts. Lydia signed her name in steady cursive, her hand firm, her pulse calm. She sealed the envelope and placed it atop the growing archive of documents. Arthur's will, their letters, the deed transfers. A record not just of property, but of resilience. She paused, fingers brushing the brooch at her collar. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, a reminder that storms always pressed against the glass. But inside, the fire held steady. When Ruth came by later with a bottle of wine, she found Lydia sitting in the lamplight, the documents stacked neatly at her side. "You look like a woman who just finished writing scripture," Ruth teased. Lydia poured them both a glass. "Not scripture, insurance." They clinked glasses softly, the sound swallowed by the crackle of firewood. For the first time since Arthur's funeral, Lydia allowed herself a long exhale, her chest lightening, but as the flames danced across the brooch's surface, she knew peace was fragile. And Callie had never learned how to let go. The lake air was sharp with pine when Drew arrived at the house again, this time without his tie. His shoulders slumped in something closer to surrender than exhaustion. He stood in the doorway for a long beat before stepping inside, the silence between them broken only by the soft click of the latch. "I've decided," he said finally, voice raw. "I'm cutting ties. She's toxic, Mom. I kept thinking I could balance it. Keep the peace. But peace with her is just another word for losing yourself." Lydia studied him from the armchair, the fire casting soft light against his drawn face. She had expected this moment eventually, but hearing it from him without prompting, without Ruth's prodding, brought a quiet relief. "You don't lose yourself by walking away," she said, her tone steady. "You find the part you thought was gone." From the kitchen, Ruth raised her glass in mock ceremony. "Well, hallelujah! You raised him to grow a spine, and it finally showed up." Drew managed a ghost of a smile before sinking into the chair across from his mother. He ran a hand through his hair, the boyish gesture cutting through the weary lines in his face. "She'll spin this as betrayal. To her, it'll always be that." "She can spin all she wants," Lydia replied. "A wheel without traction doesn't move." The spinning began within days. Callie tried reaching Lydia through mutual acquaintances, sorority sisters, former church allies, even the boutique's old vendors. Messages arrived wrapped in false sweetness. "We should talk. It's not too late." Arthur would want unity. Each one went unanswered. Lydia understood silence could be sharper than any reply. Finally, Georgia formalized what was already practice. A directive filed through the estate declared Lydia had no obligation to communicate with Callie in any capacity, personal, legal, decor, or financial. A firewall written in legalese, but felt like steel. "Lock every door," Lydia told her. "Not just the ones she's already rattled." Georgia's pen moved swiftly, her voice precise. "Consider it done. Assets locked, access denied. She'll find herself pressing against walls that will never open." Ruth celebrated the news in her own way, by organizing a dinner at Lydia's home, the first real gathering since Arthur's funeral. The guest list was small, deliberate. No family politics, no inherited obligations. Just people who had shown up when it mattered. The dining room glowed with candlelight against polished wood. Lydia wore a deep green dress, a silk scarf knotted at her throat, her brooch catching the light with quiet defiance. Drew sat beside her, not as a divided son, but as a man making his own choices. The meal was simple but rich. Roast chicken, rosemary potatoes. A bottle of red Ruth insisted had waited too long in her cellar. Laughter rose easily around the table, not forced, but organic, the kind of laughter that came from shared survival. At one point, Ruth leaned back and lifted her glass, her bracelets jingling like punctuation. "To chosen family, because blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you belong." Glasses clinked, soft but resonant. Lydia felt the warmth of the moment settle in her chest, a contrast to the weeks of icy maneuvering. For the first time, she wasn't just defending Arthur's legacy, she was building her own. Later, when the guests had gone and the dishes stood stacked neatly in the sink, Lydia lingered at the table. She ran her fingers along the grain of the wood, remembering Arthur's hand on the same surface, the quiet dinners they'd once shared here. The night was still, almost too still. She rose to close the curtains, her gaze drifting toward the drive. Empty. No headlights, no lingering shadows. Yet as she latched the window, a thought pressed sharp against her mind. Callie wasn't finished. Women like her never surrendered quietly. The fire cracked in the hearth, a reminder of warmth. But in the silence beyond it, Lydia heard something else, a restlessness, waiting for its chance. The envelope arrived in cream stationery, heavy and pretentious, as though weight could make the words inside respectable. Georgia placed it on Lydia's kitchen table with a gloved hand, as if she were setting down something diseased. Lydia slid it open with a silver letter opener, her eyes tracing the typed lines. Callie's tone, even on paper, carried that same lacquered sweetness she'd once weaponized at luncheons. Let us put the past behind us. For the sake of family and dignity, I am prepared to offer you $150,000 as a gesture to rebuild bridges. Surely we can move forward together for Arthur's memory. Lydia's mouth tightened, but she didn't laugh. Georgia did. A sharp, incredulous sound that bounced off the tile. She's offering you your own money, Georgia said, shaking her head. This is like a burglar trying to sell you your silverware. Ruth, perched at the counter with her wine glass, snorted. And undercutting the price, too. If she had any shame left, I'd almost admire the audacity. Lydia folded the letter neatly, placed it back in its envelope, and reached for her fountain pen. The scratch of ink against parchment was deliberate, final, one sentence only. My silence was never submission, just preparation. She sealed it, pressed her broached hand against the flap, and slid it across the table. Georgia, deliver this however you see fit. The reply traveled quickly. Within 48 hours, Callie was seen at the courthouse, papers clutched but never filed. Within 72, her SUV was spotted at the edge of town, overpacked with luggage and boxes crammed in the back seat. No Drew, no boutique merchandise, no allies. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as she gunned the engine, pulling away like someone escaping a fire of her own making. One whispered, "She's gone," as though they were announcing a death. Word spread faster than the taillights faded. The social clubs scratched her name from rosters. Creditors stopped chasing. They already knew the trail would end cold. By the week's end, Callie Benson was not just absent from Boulder. She was erased. That evening, Ruth uncorked another bottle on Lydia's patio. The mountains were dusk blue, the air brisk enough to make their glasses fog. She raised hers toward the horizon. She picked the wrong woman, Ruth said, her tone a blend of triumph and weariness. And then she kept picking, like a child touching a hot stove, over and over, convinced she'd beat the burn. Lydia's scarf fluttered in the wind, her brooch catching the last light of the day. She stared into the distance, her voice low, steady. Now she knows better, and still too late. Drew sat silently beside them, watching the fire pit crackle. He hadn't spoken much since Callie's departure, his grief now interlaced with something like clarity. His mother didn't press him, some truths a man had to name for himself. Later, when the house was quiet and Ruth had gone, Lydia walked through the room slowly. The air carried the faint scent of cedar from the firewood, and Arthur's photograph watched from the mantel, as constant as ever. She paused at the desk, running her fingers over the files that marked every battle. Deeds, trusts, court rulings. The silence was not victory. It was heavier, sharper, the way silence sounds after a storm. When trees still dripped from the rain, Lydia inhaled it like air she'd earned. At the window, she looked out over the lake. The water reflected the night sky in fractured silver. For the first time in months, no headlights idled at the end of the drive. No shadows lingered. No threats pressed at the glass. And yet, peace felt provisional. Fragile, the kind that could shatter with a knock at the door or a whisper in the wrong ear. Lydia touched her brooch, the cool metal grounding her. Arthur's voice lingered in memory, steady as ever. You'll know when to hold the line. She had held it. She had won. But winning was never the end. The morning was crisp when Lydia set out along the lake trail Arthur had loved. The pines stood sentinel on either side, their needles whispering with the wind. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke drifting from cabins across the water. Arthur had walked this trail every summer, a thermos of coffee in hand, pointing out wildflowers with the same quiet pride he once reserved for his students. Lydia walked it now alone, her scarf tucked against her throat, the crunch of gravel underfoot steady as breath. The lake house was fully hers, every corner restored to its original calm. No curated candles, no designer throws, just cedar, stone, and the rhythm of waves against the dock. That afternoon, she opened the house not for business, not for obligation, but for remembrance. The memorial was small, deliberately so. Only those who had shown her respect filled the living room. Faculty colleagues Arthur had mentored, the minister's wife, Ruth in her crimson scarf, Georgia with her ever-orderly folder under one arm. The air smelled of lilies and roast chicken, not of performance. The walls hummed with low conversation, laughter breaking gently like sunlight through leaves. Lydia poured wine, greeted each guest, and let herself feel the warmth of belonging. When the toast began, Ruth stood, her bracelets clinking as she raised her glass. Here's to the polyester widow who dismantled an empire, she said, her grin wicked and proud. The room burst into laughter, a sound unburdened of malice. Lydia laughed too, truly, softly, without weight. The kind of laugh she hadn't let herself release since before Arthur's illness. It filled the room, then settled in her chest like something finally returned. As dusk painted the lake in bruised purples, chairs were cleared, and the living room was quietly transformed. The award ceremony began, not of gowns or cameras, but of recognition. A representative from the college stepped forward, handing Lydia a plaque engraved with her and Arthur's names. The library wing dedication already carried their legacy, but tonight was personal. A community acknowledging the steadiness that had carried her through. Georgia leaned toward her as the applause tapered, her voice low, edged with admiration. I've never had a quieter client win louder. Lydia's fingers brushed her brooch, the metal cool under her hand. Arthur used to say the same about teaching. That the loudest lessons aren't shouted, they're lived. Georgia's smile was small but reverent. You've lived it. Later, when the guests had gone and the house was still, Lydia lingered by the fire with Ruth. The last bottle of wine sat open between them, 2 glasses half filled. You look lighter, Ruth said, her eyes narrowing playfully, like you've been carrying bricks and finally set them down. Maybe I have, Lydia replied. She leaned back in her chair, watching the fire burn lower. Or maybe I just remembered they were never mine to carry. For once, Ruth didn't answer with wit. She reached across, squeezing Lydia's hand. They sat in silence, not heavy, but whole. When Ruth left, Lydia walked to the window. The lake reflected the stars, 1,000 silver fragments dancing across the surface. For the first time in months, no shadows lurked at the edge of the drive. The glass reflected only her own face, lined, calm, resolute. She drew the curtains and prepared for bed, the laughter from the evening still echoing faintly in her ears. But as she laid her scarf across the chair, her brooch catching the firelight one last time, Lydia couldn't shake the truth she had lived long enough to know. Peace was not a permanent gift. It was a moment, a fragile, fleeting moment, and she intended to savor every second of it. The boutique hadn't changed much since the day Lydia had chosen her funeral dress. Its glass windows still reflected the mountains, its display still lined with mannequins in silk and satin. But Lydia felt different walking through its doors, lighter, unburdened, whole. She wore the same navy dress, pressed, simple, its fabric catching the light like calm water. The black scarf draped neatly across her shoulders. The silver brooch at her collar gleamed like a quiet star. The clerk, a young woman who had helped her months before, looked up from behind the counter. Recognition flickered across her face. She stepped forward, her eyes softer than they'd been on that first day. "You really wore that with dignity," she said. Her voice carried none of the saleswoman's polish now. It was reverent, almost grateful. Lydia let a smile unfold, slow and measured. "It wasn't the dress," she said. "It was the woman inside it." The clerk's eyes glistened. She nodded, then glanced at the navy fabric again as though it held history. "Would you ever consider letting us display it? Not as merchandise, but as a tribute. We've started a small collection, pieces worn by women who endured, who refused to be diminished." Lydia ran her hand across the smooth seam of the dress, remembering the sting of Callie's whisper, the silence of the crowd, the squeeze of Ruth's hand, every moment layered in its folds. "If it helps someone stand a little taller," she murmured, "then yes." She stepped into the fitting room, exchanged the navy dress for the green silk she had worn at the library dedication, and returned carrying the garment carefully across her arms. The clerk laid it on a velvet form, smoothing the fabric as though it were precious. She adjusted the hem, pinned a card at its base. "Donated in honor of resilience." Before Lydia could step back, Ruth slipped into the boutique, bracelets chiming as she always entered a room. She carried a small box. "Well," Ruth said, mischief bright in her tone, "we can't let the dress stand alone." From the box, she lifted Lydia's silver brooch, the one that had caught the sun over Arthur's grave, the one Lydia had touched every time she needed steadiness. Ruth pinned it to the collar of the dress, her hands surprisingly gentle. "There," Ruth whispered, "not just fabric, proof of quiet power." The clerk's eyes shone. She drew the curtain around the display, letting the spotlight fall warm on the navy folds and silver glint. Customers paused to look as they passed, their expressions softening, some even bowing their heads briefly. Lydia felt no pride, no triumph, only steadiness. The dress wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that dignity had always been hers to wear. She and Ruth walked out of the boutique together, the bell chiming above their heads. Outside, the sunlight was sharp against the mountains, bright enough to sting her eyes. Lydia lifted her face to it anyway, her scarf lifting in the breeze. The world was quiet, not fragile quiet, not peace on the verge of breaking, but quiet earned, settled, real. Ruth slipped her arm through Lydia's. "Well, darling," she said with a grin, "looks like polyester just became legend." Lydia's laugh was low, steady. She didn't need to add more. As they stepped into the street, she thought of Arthur, of his baritone saying she never needed louder than steady, of his trust placed in her hands like an unspoken vow. She thought of Drew, of Ruth, of the library wing etched in stone, and she thought of Callie, vanishing in her rearview mirror with nothing left but the echo of her own arrogance. Lydia tightened her scarf against the breeze, her steps unhurried as she moved into the sunlight. "At my husband's funeral," she said softly, almost to herself, "my daughter-in-law sneered at my dress." She let the sentence hang in the air like a final toast. Then her lips curved, calm and certain. But that was the day she met the woman who would outlast her,